Hello, I think that's working. Uh, Thank you for joining me for another Paro seminar. I'm sorry, I'm going to cough a little bit. I've had a chest infection. Can't seem to it's on the tail end, but it's fine. I don't cough at all until I start talking, and then I cough and cough and cough. So hopefully I won't do that too much. Feel free to kind of chat and ask questions in the comment section, and after I've talked I'll go and have a little look there. And if you're writing a question, maybe stick capital Q before it and it'll make it easier for me to see. I mean, I'll look anyway, but if there's a lot of chat I might miss your question. Hello John, Greg, Heather, Liz, hello Hazel, fantastic. Over the summer, basically what I've done is I've opened up these Paro seminars. There's less people around, people are on holidays, that kind of thing. So last month, this month, and maybe next month, I'm not sure, I'll kind of keep open. And then go back to the usual thing. Thank you for people who support me on Patreon, by the way, and allow me to do this stuff and to do these seminars. If you are interested in supporting, it's a terrible economic climate at the moment, so a lot of people have had to drop off support, and I understand that. But if you are interested in supporting, you sign up. There's about 40 of these seminars you can get access to, and hundreds of hours of book studies and courses, and also live study groups, movie groups, etc. So that's all on Patreon. But that's the promotional side of this over. What else do I need to tell you? I don't think there's anything else. I've got Spark coming up. Very excited about that. Going back in October for 5 days in this beautiful place called Crawfordsburn. I don't know if any of you online are joining me for that. Oh, Heather is there. You're joining me. Very good. So I will see some of you there. All right, what else? Kate might write something in the chat box that I'll forget to tell you if there's something important. Kate is incredibly organized and keeps me right, so keep an eye out for anything she says. Okay, let's kick off. All right, hello, welcome to another Paro seminar. What I want to do today is, I guess, kind of foreshadow a little bit about what we're going to be looking at when the summer's over. One of the books that we're going to be looking at in depth is the book Embracing the Void by Richard Boothby, and I'll also be having conversations with him. I'm going to invite him into that as well. I'll be doing talks around some of the themes in that book, so that's kind of where we're going. So today is kind of like a little bit of more of an unpacking of that and preparing for that content. And I started off with this provocative, famous question of Freud's. Different philosophers and theorists are often well known for something they said. Descartes, I think, therefore I am, Nietzsche's death of God or whatever. Well, a lot of people who don't know anything about Freud do know that he once wrote to his friend Marie Bonaparte, what does a woman want? All right, so this is close to the end of his life. He's writing this letter to his colleague and his friend. She was very key in helping him escape Nazi Germany, supporting his work. She was a psychoanalyst in her own right and was very interested in female sexuality. And he's writing to her and he's saying that there's something about desire that he's discovering in the clinic when he's talking to women that is still an enigma. Now, a lot of people look at this line and think, oh, okay, so basically Freud is throwing his hands up in the air and going, and doesn't have kind of an insight into desire and into feminine desire. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And actually, this question is really, you could see it as leading slowly but surely to an answer to what desire is as such, to what want is. So what you have in Freud is Freud discovers something, and I'm going to unpack that, and it's a bit of an enigma to him. And then what he discovered is later developed through primarily French psychoanalysis, Lacan in particular, to see that that feminine desire is the key to understanding desire as such, the key to understanding what human desire is. So, why was this an enigma? I want to start very concretely, because the thing about Freud is he was, incredibly smart, incredibly well read, but he was very skeptical of philosophy because it was so speculative. And what Freud was really interested in was clinical data. So his whole thing was basing his insights on what was happening with clients. And that always kind of led the theory, right? What was happening one-on-one with the other. And so that's why in a lot of Freud's work, it starts off almost in a crude way with people's fantasies and dreams and their understanding of their bodies, etc. And then gradually becomes more and more theoretically strong. As I say, then post-Freud becomes kind of like a type of science. And so what does he find in the clinic when he is talking to clients? Well, one of the things he discovers is that often when he was talking to women, what they desired and what they wanted seemed to be connected with the want and the desire of another, right? So the kind of the assumption that people make to this day, pretty much everybody makes this assumption if they're not, don't have training in psychoanalytic theory or whatever, is that our desires are substantive. We know what we desire, right? If there's anything I know, I know what I desire. I may not be able to get what I desire. I may even have conflictual desires, but your desire is kind of like the most substantive part of yourself. It's the key to who you are. You even get parents who talk about wanting their child to, not wanting to influence their child's desire too much, but rather let their child discover who they are. Also, you'll notice that we often talk about trying to come to know what we want. I'm always cast adrift with other people's desires and other people's expectations, but I'm really looking at finding what I want and who I am and standing on my own 2 feet. And you'll see this on Instagram and stuff like that, people putting up their posts about kind of like being true to their desire, kind of finding out who they really are and this kind of thing. And that's a very common presupposition. But then what Freud was finding in the clinic, particularly when talking with women, was that their desire seemed to be on the surface connected, as I said, to the desire of the other, what the other desired, whether it was their partner or their children or their family. They were like, empathy is a name for it, right? But a real sense of what does the other want, what does the other desire. And this was less so with men, right, whose desires seemed to be more sedimented. Right? So a friend of mine once said, she was saying that, talking about fantasies, and she said, well, my fantasy, she thought about, what is my fantasy? She said, like, kind of, my fantasy is whatever fantasy kind of turns the guy on who I'm with, right? So that is a kind of a version of this. She was going like, oh yeah, like I can perform lots of different roles. And what interests me is how to evoke and provoke the desire of the other, right? You'll get this, like a typical couple, right, where the man maybe confesses a fantasy and says, oh, I would love it if we were having sex and someone was watching us. And maybe the woman says, oh, never thought about that before, and I don't really like the thought of it. But then might see the desire that it's evoking in her partner and then play with the idea and fantasy, through talking, and then maybe kind of comes around to liking the idea and then they end up doing it. Now, the point is not that the woman here in this example wanted to do that act, but what she was enjoying was the desire that it was provoking in the other, and then came to kind of like the idea of it, right? Again, this is all anecdotal because that's kind of where this starts. But I was thinking about this earlier today, and I have a couple of very close friends who are married, and they're a very extreme version of this. It's really interesting. So he is a guy who had made a lot of money in hedge funds. And the reason why he was able to absolutely kill it was because he found that he was able to not get carried away with hype. So he always, like, if there was hype around a new product and people were talking about this new product being the thing that's going to transform the world and change everything, he literally there was a wall that just did not impact him in the slightest. And so what he would do is he would look at cold facts. He would look at how that product is actually selling, what it's doing, production, etc., etc. And if he saw a disparity between the hype and the kind of economic reality, then he would hedge against, and then he could make money. And the reason why he could do it, I mean, he was a genius in terms of like calculating intelligence, but part of that as well is his kind of profound, let's call it, inability to be influenced by the desire of the other. Whereas his partner, she is someone who, when she goes into a room, she feels everything. You know, she's got so much empathy that it's almost like, you know, if you see a kid, they cut themselves and another kid cries, because the kid in a sense doesn't have that like strong sense of sentiment itself and almost feels the pain of the other, even though it's the other person who fell over and got cut, they kind of feel the pain. She's like that. She's in a room where she's so aware of other people's desires and other people's wants and other people's kind of struggles, that she feels it in her own body. And of course, sometimes opposites attract. So sometimes those two are kind of like these very extreme examples of what I'm talking about, but that makes the relationship interesting. But that's kind of like what was being noticed was, and then of course Freud was going, but is there a want or a desire that is more substantive, that is beneath the desire of the other's desire? Because say he's kind of working with the presumption that we all would work with, which is a substantive sense of self. But what gradually became obvious is that no, this thing that he was seeing quite clearly in feminine desire is actually the truth of all desire. Universally, all of us, what we desire is reflected by the desire of the other. There is no substantive desire that is yours, that is untouched by, that is not being formed by the desire of the other. Now, any of you have been following my work for a while, or you know your Lacan, you know that I've talked about Lacan's phrase, our desires for the desire of the other, right? What we desire is the desire of the other. That's what Lacan is talking about. Lacan is talking about how this thing that seems most our own, most mine, is actually not. It's interconnected with others. This also connects with mimetic desire, René Girard, that what I desire is influenced by what someone else wants. I start to become interested in what other people are interested in. There's a thing called joint attention, which is the point when a child, very young, can start to see where the gaze of their parent is aimed, right? So they can begin to look at what captures the interest of their parent and then become interested in that object as well. So they are able to attend to the attention of the parent. So this, by the way, is one of the reasons why it kind of can be difficult in dating apps and things like that, where people often write down what they want and what they're looking for, as if what you want is set in stone. I was on the Minimalist podcast just last week. It's coming out in a few weeks and it'll be on my Patreon, just like a 4-hour discussion. But we were talking a little bit about this, about how we can often think like, who am I? What do I want? And go into the world to try to find that. But actually, every other is a type of apocalyptic possibility, in that they might open you up to new wants and new desires. So whenever you meet someone and they capture your attention. At first, you might have a list of things that you do like and you don't like, but then you start to take an interest in what they like, and say they're into, the French cinema or something like that. You find yourself starting to take an interest in that as well. You don't really like to go out for walks. You're not a hiker. The other person is, and you kind of find yourself going out and doing that. The other is, in a sense, transforming you. You are becoming someone new. You're becoming, you're being opened up to new possibilities and new ideas, just as they are with you. So it's kind of one of the beautiful things, but it means about encountering other people. But it means that we are never static. So it's not like I can ever come to know you, because there is no substantive you at the core to come to know. If you start hanging out with other people, who you are begins to change. Now, we never encounter it like that. We experience it as discovering new layers of ourselves. So we generally, when we start to change like that, it's not like we've been given a desire. It's like a desire has been uncovered. So people often talk about, I finally found myself, or when I met you, I finally, now in that last relationship, that wasn't me. I don't know who that was. I look back and I feel like I was a different person, but you have brought out the real me. Now, there's a truth to that, but that will happen again and again if you're old enough, right? Because the new you is in a sense a reborn you, a you that is being influenced by the desire of the other. Because what you want is connected to others. This, by the way, is a critique of liberalism, because in one of the basic principles of liberalism is the atomized self, the self who comes into the world and then kind of like comes in as an individual and then enters the community. So it's almost like if you're at a swimming pool, you start outside the swimming pool and then you jump into the community. But this Freudian insight is the idea that no, you start off already intertwined with other people's desire, with other people's wants. You're already, in fact, fundamentally as an infant, you are just in a sense other people's desires. And as you become a self, and as you sediment yourself in terms of an ego, you get a sense of self, but that sense of self is undergirded always by the desire for recognition. Even if someone wants to become rich, it's because they want to become rich because of the symbolic value of that they're maybe trying to impress somebody from their parents or whatever it is, right? There's always a symbolic value. There's always, recognition is always hidden and enveloped within our fantasies. That's Hegel shows that recognition is this fundamental dimension of human subjectivity or human intersubjectivity. This, by the way, is the difference between kind of Jung and Freud, because in Jungianism, there's an individual unconscious, which is a repository of your own repressions and your own kind of unconscious. And then there's a collective unconscious, which is a repository of kind of universal themes and archetypes. But for Freud, there is no individual or collective substantive unconscious. The unconscious is always collective, right? It's always connected, but it's not substantive. We're all kind of influenced by each other, but there's nobody. It's almost like if you imagine at school, a group of kids who are all trying to impress each other and they get into certain groupings. There's in their head, they might think that everybody else has this substantive desire and this is who they are. But every kid is in a sense looking to the other to see, what is the other desire? What does the other want? How do I get recognition in their eyes? And this mutual kind of like movement is what kind of coalesces into kind of groups. But there's no one person who's like the Fawns or something, who is a substantive figure who has their own private desire that's influencing everybody else. Okay, where do I want to go from there? This enigmatic nature of the other's desire is called by Freud Das Ding. Das Ding is the enigmatic, unknown abyss of the other's desire. Now, kind of very briefly, you could say, this is, by the way, for anybody who's interested, the difference between Lacanian psychoanalysis and object relations, right? So object relations analysis is all to do with, we have these internal objects, the internal ideas of our parents, our siblings, our friends. We have internal notions of them, and we relate to those objects, those internal relations, right? And we can kind of split people into good and bad, or we have to try to find ways to unify sometimes those split notions of our parents and kind of try to have a more nuanced vision of someone. But we basically have these internal objects, these internal images of these relationships, and those influence our future relationships. In Lacanian psychoanalysis, the key part of the self is not an object, but a lack of an object, right? So it's kind of has a very different starting point. This is the Lacanian critique. Is when we're infants, I'll tell a story briefly, like a myth of a baby. Their first experience of lack is frustration. There's the mother's breast or there's a bottle, and they're being fed, and then that is taken away from them, and they feel this presence and absence, the taking away and the having. So there's a frustration of like not getting, or they have certain needs, like they're hungry, but the parent misunderstands the hunger and thinks they're cold, or they're tired and they misunderstand the tiredness and think they're hungry, right? There is by definition always a disconnect between the demand of the infant and the response of the parent. And if there wasn't, it would be a disaster. If you could imagine a sci-fi future where a machine could immediately, without any time lag, always accurately respond to the need, to the demand of the infant, this would result in the most severe form of psychosis you could imagine, right? So there is this, in any normal family, there is a disconnect, a frustration between these two things. Then the infant begins to experience another type of lack, not just frustration at the presence and the absence of the bottle, but they experience the presence and absence of the agent who is giving the breast or the bottle. And they start to experience the desire of the other. They realize that the other has desires, other things that take them away and bring them to them. So that there's a desire element, and the child starts to want the desire of the other, right? To put themselves in the position of the desirous one, right? The one to kind of, so they start to ask the question, what does the other want of me? How can I be desirable to the other, right? Not when they're very young, but that's kind of, it begins to be an issue, and that's called privation, the experience of the presence and absence of the other's desire. And that's a more fundamental absence, because desire itself is absence. Desire is the concretization of lack. When you desire something, you do not have something. If I give you my desire, I'm giving you my lack. There's something lacking. So you can, in one sense, whenever someone's desire is present, what you're experiencing is a presence of an absence, the presence of a kind of vacuum, a ghost, right? A ghost is the presence of an absence. Desire is the presence of an absence. So the infant begins to experience desire. And then finally, there's castration, which is where the infant starts to realize that they can't be the answer to the other's desire. The other has other desires. The parent has a job, has a partner, has other interests. And the infant begins to, as I say, with joint attention, begin to work out that there are other things that the other wants that they cannot provide. And then those things start to take on an interest to the child, right? So what you see here at a very fundamental level is that at our core, there is a type of wrestling with different forms of lack that become increasingly more complex and interesting. So in this experience, the infant is experiencing the das Ding of the other. There's an abyssal dimension. What does the other want? Where do I fit within the other's desire? And fantasy, PH fantasy. There's fantasy with an F, which is fantasies we're aware of. When fantasy is spelt with a PH, that generally refers to fantasies that we're unaware of, unconscious fantasies. But the infant begins to make up stories, kind of very, very basic structures of how to get the desire of the other, or where they fit within the desire of the other. And another key thing I should mention about this as well is it's not just that you want the desire of the other, you also want to distance yourself from it. The infant has a love-hate relationship with the other's desire. Too much and you're suffocated, you can't be an individual, right? And too little and you're left out on your own, and you're basically, you can't be, both extremes, you can't be a self. Both extremes are very, very damaging. But the child is then working out how they relate to this desire of the other, not getting swallowed up by it, but also being drawn by it and wanting it. And jouissance is the name, by the way, of this desire and this pleasure that we get from, well, okay, so what's jouissance? I said, like, so when we grow up, when we get older, right, and we have our ego and we have our day-to-day going through life, someone comes along and they evoke that early form of desire, and they evoke in us something of the das sting of our original parents. I've talked about this, I think, in the last seminar, so you can go back to listen to that. And I think maybe the one before it as well. But this das sting, this enigmatic desire of the other that the infant experiences, is replayed in adulthood. And whenever that happens, we end up doing crazy things. It kind of decenters us, destabilizes our ego. We end up having an affair or blowing up at work and losing our job. Something happens that and it's a painful pleasure. It's called jouissance. It's the eruption outside of our ego of a replaying of this basic kind of early experience with the other's desire. It's called jouissance. Right. So where do we go from here? Okay. So if this is the case, right, that when Freud asks, what does a woman want? It starts off because he notices that some of the women he's talking to, their desire is the desire of the other, right? Not a substantive want in and of itself, but weirdly a want that seems to be the want of the other. And if this then becomes a kind of universal, which is actually the truth of desire in general, the truth of all desire, even though it comes out in different ways. And by the way, I saw a meme the other day. There's a woman who does these memes. They're a bit nasty, to be honest, because they're always attacking her husband. But it was a meme where it's like how my husband looks at the last pair and how I look at the last pair. And she's looking at the last pair in the kitchen, and you see her in her dialogue, which is, oh, that's the last pair. I wonder if my kids would like that. I think I'll put it into their lunchbox. They'll enjoy it. And then it's her husband, and her husband sees the last pair and says, oh, I'll take that and put that in my smoothie. Right? But that's an example of it in a way. Is like that woman is perceiving that she feels herself taken up in the desire of the other, right? Which can also be very painful, right? Because you always start feeling that you are always sacrificing yourself to the other's desire. So it can cause all sorts of feelings of discomfort and frustration and difficulty. But it's also, in a sense, the truth of how all desire functions. So the answer is not to try to get to your substantive desire, but to kind of like begin to enjoy and relate differently to that structure. But right, so if that's the case, and so my desire is interconnected with yours, with the world's, that somehow I am part of the world, fundamentally interwoven into desire. And if there is no substance, right, that the substance is a type of epiphenomenon or illusion that arises out of the fantasies of working out what the other desires, then what in psychoanalysis is important is how do we remain open to the desire of the other? How do we comport ourselves to the other's desire in a way that we don't close ourselves off from it entirely, and we don't get completely destroyed by it, right? We don't get completely consumed so that there is no us anymore. We're just kind of caught up in being an instrument for whatever our parents or our partner want of us, right? Both of these extremes are not good. So there's a question of that. Now, what has this got to do with mysticism? Because that's what I want to touch on, and then we'll open it up to some questions. Well, one of the central questions within religion is how to comport yourself properly to the abyssal dimension of mystery in reality itself, and how that connects to kind of a mystery within yourself. So within religion, there's always been this idea of a dimension. Now it's conceptualized differently, but a dimension, a mystery, an abyssal dimension that generates horror and terror and desire and love, right? So you get that within like biblical text, you get that within mystical writings. It's this horror of this fearful experience, but also this at the same time really enjoyable experience, right? It's religious jouissance, right? The mystical experience is religious jouissance. It's a painful pleasure. It's a fear-inducing, ego-dissolving, but also kind of like fundamentally has a gravitational pull to it as well. And for the mystical experience is being open to that dimension of reality, not closing yourself down and then just being basically a cog in the machine, a kind of behavioristic, mechanistic cog within the economic system. But somehow there is a dimension of gift. There is a dimension that is transcendent, right? Otherwise than being. Let's say there's a few different ways that religion kind of like understands that, but at its core, that's one of the core kind of principles of a kind of mystical vision. So if that's true in religion, then in psychoanalysis there's actually something similar going on, right? And this has not generally been seen very clearly, and Freud didn't see it himself, but the psychoanalyst, this psychoanalytic theory says that we need to find a way to comport ourselves to this abyssal dimension within our neighbor and within our enemy, within the other. That there is this terrifying and also very appealing abyss and void of the other, which we call desire. And often what we do is we try to protect ourselves from it. We either think that our partner is the same, as in we get rid of all of their otherness and we treat them as just the same as us, and we look at the people around us and we don't see how they are infused with this transcendent pulsating desire, right? And we have enemies who we think that pulsating desire is truly horrific and awful, and all the worst things are going on in that bubbling cauldron, right? Somehow to be human is to be semi-permeable in regards to the other's desire, and to allow their desire and who they are to transform you as you transform them. Now, where these two connect, interestingly, one reading of Jesus is that in this idea of loving your enemy, which is one of the main or innovations within the work of Jesus, is love your enemy, right? And also within the biblical text itself, where it moves from love God, then love God and love your neighbor, to love your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, that is how you love God, right? So you've got that kind of progression you see in the New Testament. Potentially, what you see, one of the radical moves within this tradition is that the religious experience is the one in which you are radically open to your neighbor, to the desire of your neighbor, to being destabilized, to being derailed by the other's desire, to be able to put yourself somehow in the way of that, in a way that will transform you and transform them. And that potentially is the mystical experience if you want to take seriously this idea of loving your neighbour. And this, I think, is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is trying to get to in the Letters and Papers from Prison. At the end of his life, he is writing about a Christianity beyond theism and atheism, beyond the church and its traditional forms, beyond all of that. And he calls it worldly Christianity. And he talks about this radical openness to the neighbour, to the other, a radical pouring oneself out to the other. But he is executed before he can develop those ideas. But I think that I don't think he would have been able to get there either necessarily. But I think using this Lacanian idea, we can actually start to understand what it might look like what a community might look like based on that idea. And we can begin to understand the radicality of this injunction, this call to love our neighbour, which is a call to somehow be open to the destabilizing presence of the other. Now, just 2 weeks ago, I was talking to Jay on that sofa, and there's a talk you can find on Revolution Church on YouTube. And I was talking about listening, how listening well, that was the topic of the conversation. And one of the things I was talking about was how we all have an unconscious, right? But also communities have an unconscious. There are elements of ourselves and of our communities, our political and religious communities, that we do not see. Blind spots that you can only see through being open to the other. And the other has blind spots that they don't see, right? So we need each other's eyes in order to see ourselves, right? That the point of listening well is not a patronizing thing. Oh, I'm going to listen to them, so they have to listen to me. It's also, you can't listen well if you already think you're right. Oh, I've got the right political position, I've got the right religious position, whatever. You can't really listen well because you already have the answer. Again, you can listen in a gracious way to the idiots who think something different, or the poor lost soul who's not as wise as you are, right? But you can't really open yourself up to the other when you know you've got the right answer. Pretty much. You've got it pretty much sorted out. You know the curve of history. This is the progressive thing, is you kind of know where things are going. You know you're on the right tracks, whatever. In this notion, we don't know ourselves and we don't know what the future holds. And it's only as I open myself up to the other, to the neighbour, whoever that neighbour is, and somehow allow myself to listen to them, to see myself through them, to be transformed by them, that I begin to change, and at the same time they begin to change, right? Your openness to them, I can invite an openness from them into you, and both change. So an example of this, which I've used before, but is in the typical debate between, say, a Republican and a Democrat, is the Republican is arguing why Republicanism is right and trying to convince a Democrat. And the Democrat is arguing why the Democratic Party is correct, mostly whatever, and the Republican should join them. And of course, both sides know they're likely not going to be able to persuade the other, but they might persuade some people in the audience. So that's the debate. But the other type of debate is where, say, a Republican and a Democrat come together, and the Republican looks at the Democrat and says, I think I'm right. I think the way we see the world is the right way to do things in terms of economics and politics. But you think I'm mad. You think I'm missing something, and I don't understand. So tell me what you see in me, and I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to allow you to be an instrument of my further conversion. And simultaneously, the Democrat says, I think I'm right. I think I've got this down. I think you're wrong. And I can't understand why you would be the position you're in, but I must be missing something. Let me see myself through your eyes, and I'm going to let you be an instrument of my further conversion. And what happens is the two people open themselves up to the other, and they're not converted to one side or the other. They're kind of converted more within their own positions, and things kind of move forward. Like, it's not, and this is the problem with ecumenism in a sense, it's not my religion's right for me, your religion's right for you. It's my religion's wrong for me and your religion's wrong for you. And as we encounter and stay in the fiery presence of each other's desire, that we can do good work within those traditions and things move forward. And that for me comes down to the very heart of what I mean by Christianity. I'm not when I was on the Minimalists, one of the presenters, he converted to Catholicism recently, and the other presenter was asking him to talk about how he defends the Catholic Church, and what my own position on that kind of stuff and how to defend the church. I'm like, I got no interest in defending any church. I got no skin in the game when it comes to that. Like, my only claim is that we need to be somehow existentially open to this abyssal dimension of the other's desire. That is an incredible call that will save civilization if enough people do it. And that civilization will be destroyed if we don't. If we shut ourselves off from that in all sorts of ways, we will create more divisions and more violence. That's I think, what I mean by Christianity in its kind of most grounded form. That's all it is. It is this mystical, it's almost like saying, if you want to be open to the untamable abyss of the mystery at the heart of all existence, the only way to do that is nothing else than being open to the untamable abyss of the other's desire. And that's kind of what Richard Boothby is arguing for in this new book, Embracing the Void. Okay, so I think I've covered pretty much what I want to cover. I'll just sum it up, and then I'll see if you have any questions. So I started off by, what does a woman want? Which was the idea that in the clinical structure, you find that often men had more sedimented desire, so it was less easy to see the structure of desire. But there were a number of women who were very empathetic and very connected with the desire of the other. This led to a crisis of sorts, because it's like, desire should be our own, substantive, something that I have, and something that is me, that I can understand. Even there was a movie actually made by Mel Gibson's The Star called What Does a Woman Want, where this guy has an electric shock and he hears the inner thoughts of women. So the idea of the movie is, I know what women want because I can hear their inner thoughts. But the Freudian thing is, no. You wouldn't know what people want if you could hear their inner thoughts, because we don't know what we want, because what we want is what the other wants, right? So that leads to this universal nature of desire, which then leads to the idea that desire of the other is both desirous, and it draws us in and repels us. There is something terrifying and untamable about the abyss that is within the other. And then I said that in religion, one of the highest concerns has always been an openness to a transcendent, untamable, abyssal dimension within reality. Something that is awe-inspiring, terror-producing, transformative, right? In all of that richness. Think of someone like William Otto. Is it William Otto? The idea of the holy. Forget his name, Otto, I know. But it has that beautifully in it, the mysterium tremendum. I think he calls it the tremendous, terrifying mystery of reality. Well, what Freud is doing is saying that tremendous, mysterious, terrifying reality is within us all, and it's within the other. And that actually, perhaps then, with someone like Boothby and myself are saying, is that this call to love one's enemy is a call precisely not to go into the desert, take DMT and experience kind of like whatever, oneness, whatever, that's all fine to do. But ultimately, the real kind of mystical experience is a radical movement to the neighbor, to the enemy, being open to their desire, and it's transformative power on you and you on them that joins us together, and that creates forward momentum. Okay, let's see if there's any questions. Oh, Courtney said, I got your message the other day. You mentioned Why Women Write More Letters Than They Send by Darian Leader. And you were asking me, did I recommend that book? I probably did. I definitely will have recommended Darian Leader before. He's a very good Lacanian. I've probably mentioned that book. He also wrote The New Black, which is a really interesting book on melancholy. So Darian Leader is a very good writer. Liz says, question, I know this is early in the talk, but I almost think that what women desire is to be desirable. And this is something I'm really, really considering personally. Yeah, Liz, absolutely. I mean, that is this, and it's more obvious for when Freud, that's why What Do Women Want was the way in. By the way, this always happens in science or whatever, is it's something is seen in one area and then that opens up some sort of universal truth, right? So there's kind of like, you can see, alienation of a certain group of people, and then, existentialism says, well, in a certain way, we're all alienated from ourselves. So there is this structure of that you see very, very clearly often in a feminine desire, which is the desire to be desired. And the masculine structure is often the desire for the other. So that's why it fits. If you almost think of sex as in biological sex, like if you think of a man and a woman, they mate. And then gender is the sexual fantasy that allows you to mate. And so, so there's certain sexual fantasies and desires that human beings need in order to have sex. And those come down to certain desire fantasy structures. And anyway, so the one you're talking about that's exactly what Freud was seeing, the desire to be desired. He said it in some controversial ways that I won't get into. By the way, this book is one I would recommend. If you can see it, Sex on the Couch, Richard Boothby. It's very good on that subject. Highly recommend. Stop talking about Pete. Sorry, I'm laughing at some of the comments. So Puma says, how much of this is the need to please others? Women desire to be pleasing. They put others' desires above their own. Women ever been given the freedom, permission to think about their own desires? Yeah, I mean, so that's almost going, that, like, I think that is a common approach. But what lies behind that question, in a sense, and you'll know I've covered this now. Sorry. I touched the phone when I was getting the book, and that really messed up the image. So it'll fix in a second. There we go. Often, whenever someone feels themselves like I'm sacrificing all the time to my family, I'm sacrificing to the other, right? Often, what you can feel is I want to get to what I desire. And that's a very legitimate kind of feeling. I want to get to what I desire. But Freud, this psychoanalytic thing would be like, well, it's kind of the opposite. Actually, in a way, that's closer to the truth. Now, you might want to sediment yourself a little bit more, right? Too much empathy is exhausting, would be exhausting. I wouldn't know as being a heartless guy, but I know my friends who are very empathetic, it's exhausting for them. They go to a party and they really do have a sense of feeling, and they'll always have to bring gifts. You'll know, some of you will be these people, they'll always have to bring, bake something really nice and bring really nice, thoughtful gifts to a party and stuff. And it's always so beautiful, but it can be exhausting. You can end up feeling absolutely wrecked. And there are cultural dimensions to this. Definitely, but there's also psychic dimensions to it as well. That is why, again, recommending Sex on the Couch. He has this brilliant analogy in this book where he says a grandfather clock. Let's see if I can get this right, but it has the thing that goes back and forth, right? The technical term is the thing, right? But if that was just going back and forth with no help, it would eventually stop. It would stand still. So there's another bit within the clock that gives a little push to the swinging handle, right? So a little tiny push every swing, so as it keeps going. And Boothby's analogy is, in society there are all sorts of cultural, religious, biological reasons for lots of differences that we see within the sexes. So, for example, men tend to be more fetishistic, and women kind of can often be more phobic, right? It's not 100%, but you can kind of notice it. There's loads of things you notice that are very interesting. But there's also differences like look at your nails, right? Just look at your nails right now. If you're watching this live, look at your nails, and then you go like, so how did you look at them? If you're a woman, you probably looked at them like that, sorry. And if you're a man, you probably looked at them like that. Not universal, but that's definitely that's cultural, right? That's a cultural thing, but it's funny how you notice it. Oh yeah, women often look at their nails like that, men often look at their nails like that. There's lots of silly little differences. And I don't know if that worked or not, I haven't tested it. But it was mentioned by Boothby. Oh yes, but the interesting thing about the Freudian view is it's that feminine sexuality is closer to the truth. That's the kind of thing, is actually that experience is closer to the truth than male sexuality. That's why, you know, you can say to a certain extent, women pretend to be women and men believe that they're men, right? So a guy kind of believes that he's a guy and wears the same clothes throughout and has a sense of masculinity, whereas women can often be more playful about themselves, you know, dress up in different ways. That saying, you know, a man gets up and says, what shall I wear today? And a woman gets up and says, who shall I be today? Again, not universal features, but this notion of the playfulness of one's identity is in a sense closer to the truth than the substantive notion, which is the more masculine notion of like, I have a substantive identity that is separate from the other. So yeah, anyway, I'm just waffling now. Oh yeah, this says, I think desire is like language. What you want is possibly defined by all the things you don't. Liz, absolutely, like in psychoanalysis and in Lacan, language and desire are basically so intertwined. And one of the ways that language and desire are very similar is that language never hits the thing, right? You can never, language only gives you more language, more words. You never get to an object. Hegel once said, the birth of the word is the death of the world. The birth of the word is the death of the world. And so an example Todd McGowan uses, he says, you can never just eat an apple. As a human being, you cannot just eat an apple. Now, you could maybe, if you're completely distracted, not thinking about anything, eat an apple, but when you eat an apple, there's always a symbolic dimension to it. Like maybe you like to think of yourself as healthy. You like how apples look. They remind you of when you were young. You can never just buy jeans. Even if you buy regular, normal jeans, you're buying regular, normal jeans because you're the type of person who doesn't buy stupid, fancy jeans, but is a kind of down-to-earth person, right? So there's a certain sense in which language is always not hitting quite the thing. There's this symbolic dimension to it. And the same as desire. Desire never lands on something substantive. It just kind of keeps moving. It's metamic. That's why in capitalism, you never get the object that will satisfy you because you can't get the object. What you have is just the ongoing mimetic kind of movement of desire. Oh yeah, Courtney says, yeah, this is interesting. There's a lot of difficult messages, and Courtney just mentions the message of saying to a young girl or a young woman that she's free to identify and pursue her desire, and then when she's older, she realizes has never had that freedom at all. Yeah, that's very, very true. And you know, it's obviously true. It can be true for everybody and anybody, but I think in particular, if someone's, you know, it's like, yeah, when you fall for this notion of a substantive desire, it can cause all sorts of problems. I do love this notion. I think it's healthy for us to remind ourselves that every person we meet can recreate us and rebirth us. We can be born again, and other people's desires will change and form and reform our desires, and that in a way being open to the other is being open to being constantly, and not constantly because that would be too much, but a few times in our life, maybe say it that way, a few times in our life becoming something else and something new, and having a fluidity. But it's very, very difficult, and we don't want to be too fluid as well because that's exhausting. So it's a tightrope. I mean, in one way, whenever Jung said religion is a protection against God, I think it's a great phrase, because at its best, we cannot stand in front of the kind of the mystery, the abyss of the mystery of the other without destruction. We need some protection. We need a semi-permeable membrane. If the membrane is too permeable, there's problems. If it's too solid, there's problems. We kind of need a kind of semi-permeable protection, which is interesting now. Chris is asking you, do you have a version of this for Buddhists for whom desire is the cause of suffering? Yeah, this is really interesting. So a lot of the kind of more Buddhist notions, and there's like Zen Buddhism, I think, is very, very close to kind of what I'm trying to do. But yeah, a lot of Buddhism is about kind of, in a sense, seeing the destructive nature of desire and attempting to kind of like gradually disinvest yourself from desire and gradually disinvest yourself from that. How does that connect with this? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've had a couple of discussions with Buddhists on this, because what I'm trying to say is that desire is fundamental, and the issue is really a form of desire that's destructive, not desire as such. And I think there's probably a version of that within Buddhism. So I would love to, find a Buddhist scholar and kind of discuss those issues. It's the difference between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. And Schopenhauer was very Buddhist, very influenced by Buddhism, and Schopenhauer's solution to the kind of like what he said was the will to life, but this desire that can never be sated, can never be that's always ongoing, that causes suffering, was kind of more of the Buddhist solution. Nietzsche, who was very Schopenhauerian, but he went a different way. He kind of said, well, no, there is a way to embrace desire. So yeah, anyway, it's a good question. Okay, there's a lot of questions, so I'm maybe just going to jump on a couple more. Courtney says, why would immediate meeting of the infant's every need result in psychosis? Is it because there's never the presence of an absence? Yeah. Followed by the lack of desire and the lack of individual. Yeah, so Courtney's asking, why would the immediate meeting of the infant's every need result in psychosis? So that's the question. She says, is it because there's never a presence of an absence followed by lack of desire and lack of individuation of self? Yeah, I mean, basically that's it. You could say that psychosis is the results from the kind of like a non-differentiation at that very what's called the no of the father. So a psychosis is there's an over proximity of the other. There's not a space of differentiation. So for say someone who's having a psychotic break, they're completely taken over by voices where they completely disappear in terms of who they are, where they start and where they stop. So there would be kind of like, I imagine, like an extreme form of psychosis, because there isn't the space for that splitting. Because if you take the psychoanalytic notion that you've got autism, psychosis, perversion, neurosis, is four kind of basic structures. Perversion is where there's a partial separation, and then neurosis is where there's a full separation, and then autism and psychosis are kind of like the separation hasn't happened. And yeah, so if you could imagine the child getting all of its needs met, there'd be no frustration, there'd be no ability to separate, to unfuse from the mother-infant relation. It would be, in terms of structural anthropology, it would be no incest taboo, right? No separation from the mother. The incest taboo is you cannot stay in the private enjoyment of your mother. You have to find substitute enjoyment in the world. So that incest taboo would not be instigated. So therefore you wouldn't come into the world as a subject as such. I mean, you would be a partial subject, but it would be very messed up, I would say. Greg says, is there an even deeper level to desire, as in we desire the desire of the other, but we also seek out a big other to authorize this desire as well? This is social implications. I mean, Greg, very good. Actually, whenever you started reading your question, I was going like, no. And then I was like, oh no, I see your point. That's very good. Because you're bringing in the big other. what Greg's talking about there is, we have I desire, the desire of the other, but often our desires are underpinned by something more basic. Can be called the big other, and that's very important to bear in mind. I would still say it's the same structure, however, because the big other doesn't exist for Lacan. So the most basic, I wonder how you could say this. I wonder if paranoia, I'll say this and it might be useful or it might not, but right, paranoia is an interesting structure because the paranoid person correctly sees that religious, cultural, social authorities are incompetent, self-divided, broken. So the paranoiac is often incredibly accurate at seeing the issues within society and getting it right sometimes. So someone like Alex Jones is an example, or whatever, probably someone who has a paranoid structure, can often see things that other people can't see, right? But the paranoid person has less credulity than the regular person, right? I go through life and I trust doctors and I trust the government to a certain extent. I trust, to a certain extent, I trust the structures that are around me more so than I probably should, right? The paranoiac is someone who doesn't. So they have less credulity and in some sense kind of see the truth. The truth is that these systems are self-divided. There's idiots in every structure. When we think that, the government, for example, somehow has greater expertise than, a group of intelligent people thinking about these issues outside the government, we're kind of wrong. If you've ever seen In the Thick of It, I recommend this highly. There's a series called In the Thick of It, British sitcom, that is basically behind the doors of power in the UK. And there's a movie called In the Loop. And so recommend it. And I've got a friend who worked in a consulate, and she said it's kind of very true, what a shit show it is behind the scenes. So the paranoiac kind of sees that, but then the paranoiac has too much credulity on some big other behind these systems who controls everything, who pulls the strings, some undivided other who has all of this power and intelligence, right? So Spectre and James Bond or whatever, some super powerful group behind the scenes. And so the paranoiac reveals this weird structure of incredulity to kind of everyday society, and then too much credulity to some kind of big other who has all of this control. So we, to a certain extent, there's a big other that we're all working with. Paranoia is just very obvious to see. But anyway, I don't know if that has any use, but it was just something I was thinking about. Let's see, I'm going to just jump into one or two more. Oh, there's Kate. I'll read this one, right? So if this all started because male desire seems to be more sedimented and female desire seems to be more reactionary, that sounds like a negative word, but more kind of like empathetic. But yeah, how is that difference explained if all desires are right? Yeah, so there are theories to that. One of the main theories that Freud gave for that is that through the Oedipal stage, Lacan adds through the mirror stage and the Oedipal stage, but let's just do the Oedipal stage, is a little boy generally has to defend themselves more against, to differentiate more against the mother. So the little boy, the little girl generally doesn't have to differentiate as much from the mother, right? So that means that they remain less sedimented in terms of their ego formation as a defensive formation against women. So like Freud basically says masculinity is a defense against women. That's it. He says, in one sense, masculinity is this interesting defensive gesture that has to separate from the mother so that eventually they can find someone else to go out with. Whereas the little girl generally doesn't have to. And that's why, by the way, these are not universal structures, because masculine and feminine don't map one-to-one with biology. But you will kind of often see this. Little boys get very disgusted when their mum tries to kiss them or something, or they fall over and they hurt their knee and they're about to start crying, and then they see other people around them and they have to be a big boy, and they want the hug of their mother, but then they have to pretend that they're strong, right? And they do want their mother, but of course they do. So little boys, you can see all these defensive mechanisms that are developing, which then creates the look of a more sedimented sense of self. That's one of the things. But again, that book, Sex on the Couch, has a really good chapter on it. And whether or not you're kind of convinced by the argument, it's a very good summation of exactly why we see some of these differences play out. So there's a question that I missed something, because I see Courtney says, I hope Pete addresses this as well. I missed that one. But you said, I thought women are historically considered nurturers, home earth, men providers, hunters, emotional labour and relationships nurturing. Yeah, that's another thing that was seen, and there's an interesting kind of like theories for this, is that often, so if one of the things that woman's desire is connected to the desire of the other, for Freud, men often end up wanting another mother. So often men will end up wanting to be mothered, and so a woman ends up being a nurturer, not only to the kids but also to the husband. So sometimes women will say, I have 4 kids, I've got the 3 kids and I got my husband, right? So there is a certain sense in which we see within our culture the nurturer role. And it's encouraged by the man who seems to want to be nurtured. And again, Freud has kind of some ideas as to why that might kind of be the case. But it's very frustrating. Can be a frustrating role. Lots of great stuff here, and there's lots of back and forth. Oh, Liz, you mentioned knightly chivalry. That as a kind of connected with this, and just to say that's very true. Courtly love is kind of the beginning of the very kind of poetic and systematic reflection on a certain form of desire and love that is basically still predominant today, although there's a lot of critiques of it. The funny thing is, some people are critical of Freud because they see him as upholding, certain kind of masculine and feminine rules. But actually what Freud was simply doing is trying to understand why they exist, and that they don't have to be universal. But he is playing with this idea of there is something going on, and courtly love is the most pure example of it. So in courtly love, you have a lady who's usually married to somebody else, and you have a knight, and the knight falls for the lady, but it's completely inaccessible, so they can't be together. But the knight then dedicates himself to battles and protection of the lady who he loves, and she loves him, and she basically, through just a glance, just a gaze, just her presence, provokes in him this sacrificial demand when she is with someone else. So you have that notion of courtly love that kind of resonates in an interesting way to this day. If you make a movie that has that structure, it'll generally be quite appealing. There's something about that structure, and then Freud is trying to give an answer to why that is. Oh yeah, Greg's so hard. I'm sorry, people are having really good discussions here, and the thing only lets you have 200 characters a go, which means you can't really get too heavy or deep. That can be frustrating. So definitely have grace for each other in that, because when you start writing things in 200 characters or less, you'll always not be able to be as nuanced as you want, and that's why I hate Twitter, to be honest. Amy says, I 100% heard Courtney love. I know everyone thinks I'm saying Courtney love whenever I say courtly love. Okay, I'll do one more question and I'll jump. Here's one from Kev. The focus here is how others with their desires and ideas shapes our own inner world. However, isn't there also a role that material realities have on shaping us? Yeah, that's very important. But interestingly, it's material realities themselves are kind of infused with desire. And this maybe brings us back to what Greg was saying about the big other. The big other is like, there's structures within our society that maybe nobody desires. Actually, maybe you could have a whole group, no one really desires it, but it still continues to function. Sometimes because of maybe biological, cultural, historical factors, and also for psychological reasons. So again, coming back to that analogy of the grandfather clock, is that we are definitely creatures that are influenced by biological, cultural, historical phenomenon. But Freud's big insight was that there's also this inner psychological kick that often keeps things going when otherwise they wouldn't. So for example, let's say in our society, women are more kind of told from young, or even go back 100 years, maybe even easier, to stay in a relationship if it's bad. And partly because if they went out on their own, they wouldn't have any money, they wouldn't have any support. So purely for material reasons, there's a reason to stay with someone even if they're abusive, right? So you kind of stay in a relationship that is bad for you for cultural, historical, economic reasons. But then Freud would say, but also then even when those aren't there, sometimes you see the structure still play out, that someone could leave and would be okay and would have support, but there's something that's stopping them. And this is interesting because the notion of what Freud called female masochism, it was a term, but where someone, masochism is a universal feature as well. Actually, like that was one of the things, is why do we hurt ourselves? Why do we relive things, replay things, stay in situations longer than we should, etc., etc. So this, what is this masochism that seems to be universal within human subjectivity? As for another time, another subject, but it's an interesting question. But one of the things Freud was noticing was men, a lot of the masculine structure objectify women, right? So they objectify women to the extent of even just seeing women as conquests, something to use. And you see this often within an obsessive neurotic, is that they can only really sexually desire someone they objectify. They actually, the obsessive man loves what he can't desire, desires what he cannot love. So, he'll have his wife who he loves but doesn't have sexual intercourse with, and then he'll have someone he has sex with but objectifies and doesn't care about, right? That's an extreme example, but that would be an extreme obsessive kind of example. And you have the mafia boss on The Sopranos or whatever, you have the wife and you have the mistress. And why am I saying that? Oh yeah. And then if the woman's desire is connected with the desire of the other, then the woman can often end up desiring their own objectification through the desire of the sadistic, obsessive other. And so what's happening is it's not just historical, economic, or anything like that. This is also getting down to a kind of a way that desire functions, where someone is kind of seeing themselves in the desire of the other. The example actually used in Boothby's book, which I think is a great example, is the famous book, The Story of O, that was written, I think, in 1956. It's a French book, and it's this kind of it's a sadomasochistic book, but it's about this woman who goes to this chateau, and she's mistreated and abused in all sorts of ways. And the book was anonymously published at the time. And a famous journalist called Pierre, the famous journalist wrote the foreword to it. And anyway, it was a scandalous book, and people were trying to figure out who wrote it. The police interviewed the journalist who wrote the foreword to get him to reveal who wrote it. People thought he wrote it. People thought obviously he knew who wrote it, but he always kept quiet, never said who it was that wrote the book. And it was generally seen as a book that was written by a man. That's still going, yeah. It was written by a guy because it was so objectifying of a woman. It was so kind of like the fantasies would have been were so masochistic against the woman. But then it turns out that it was a woman who wrote it. I forget her name, but she was in an affair with the journalist, right? So they were in this very sexual relationship. And at one stage, she was feeling that she was losing her attractiveness. And one of the things that they did is that she would write these fantasies for him and write them and give him these fantasies, and that would evoke his desire. And then, so the relationship continued to be very, very passionate through the exchange or through her giving these letters of fantasy. And then he convinced her to publish them. He said, "This is great, you should publish this." So she published it, and it's the story of O. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of people thought a woman would not have or could not have written that. But what you can see is that she was desiring his desire, and she was figuring out a way to evoke his desire. And this objectification was something that he found at a phantasmic level, at a fantasy level, he found that very appealing. So she was playing with that fantasy. But then she also enjoyed it. So whenever she's talked about this, she goes, "Listen, whether it's his fantasy or my fantasy," she says, "I can't tell. I was enjoying writing this to him." So the masochistic fantasy kind of was being generated by his desire, but it was also her desire, and that kind of moved. So in that structure, that's just a way of saying that if an obsessive man has a tendency to objectify a woman and mistreat her, and then if there's a feminine desire in terms of a kind of neuroticism, which in a sense finds herself empathetically locked into the desire of the other, then that can give an explanation for why someone might stay too long in an abusive relationship, even if all of the possibilities for leaving are there. And in that case, psychoanalysis is very, very helpful, because that can help the person work through those obstacles. Can I say one more thing and then I'll stop? Sorry. I was just thinking that in philosophy of religion, there is this question: can God create a rock too heavy for God to lift? And it's the idea that, it's basically seeing if the idea of God is logically inconsistent, because, if God is omnipotent, then either way God is not omnipotent. Either God can't lift all stones or can't make a stone so heavy God can't lift. Silly little question. But in a way, we are that God. In a way, in our inner life, because we're gods in our imagination, we can do anything, but we create rocks too heavy to lift. We create obstacles for ourselves that we can't overcome. And that's a weird thing. Why do we create rocks too heavy for us to lift? Why do we stay in abusive situations when actually, to the cool light of day, we could leave? And this notion of desire can begin to lead to an understanding of why that might be the case. And as we become aware of that, we can begin to maybe unpick it a little bit. Okay, hope you got something out of that. Thank you so much for being here, being part of this, and I will see you next month.